Hi, welcome to Close Listening. Well, not really, because this is one of my rare deviations from musical content. I wanted to talk about a political, though barely political, topic. So, we live in this age where it's increasingly hard to admit you like someone who has very different politics than your own. A lot of people quote that James Baldwin line about how we can agree to disagree, but not about things that threaten my existence or other people's existence. I'm sure that was a beautiful quote when it was originally said. I find it a bit troubling because lots of policy implications can be threatening to people's existence. And so I think we're at risk of maybe taking that quotation too far. But regardless, I consider myself solidly on the left. So I find it quite fascinating when I find someone who identifies as having politics very different than my own, i.e., on the right, and I still find them pleasant to listen to. Now, because my political feelings are so strong, that's never going to be for a hard right wing ideologue. So, sorry, Ben Shapiro, we aren't buddies. But there are a couple of conservative public figures out there who I do find myself finding pleasant enough to listen to a surprising amount of the time. One of them is the co host of Breaking Points, formerly Rising, Sagar and Jetty. And the other, who's going to be the focus of this video, is the Canadian conservative, JJ McCullough. So, who is JJ McCullough? JJ is someone I discovered a few years back when he was a pundit on channels like Sun News, Canada's now defunct equivalent of Fox News. He had this quirky mustache, and I don't remember too much about what he'd say, but basically, as a committed leftist ideologue, I found his TV right wing talking points generally quite annoying. I was shocked a few years later when YouTube started recommending these home filmed, fun commentary videos from JJ McCullough that I quite liked and didn't really seem to bring up right wing policy positions. Though one kind of exception was that he would express his dissatisfaction with Quebec nationalism, with bilingualism in Canada. And while I didn't agree with him on that, at the same time, I was an Anglophone living in Quebec and feeling really bad about the fact that I wasn't learning French, so I didn't exactly resent JJ for those positions either. On top of that, McCullough's overall aesthetics seemed genuinely cosmopolitan. He was fascinated with the world and not in a conservative, conquer the world kind of way. No, he seemed generally fascinated with all the world's treasures. He even had the Bolivian Wapala flag, which is associated with the socialist indigenous president, Evo Morales. So I started to develop the sense that maybe JJ McCullough wasn't what he used to be. But once I watched enough of his videos, he would still drop references to being a conservative. And one came up recently, and it really hit me hard because I thought, yeah, this guy really has some serious differences with me. Namely, he compared the social democrat U.S. Congressmember Ilhan Omar to the far-right conspiracy theorist Marjorie Taylor Greene as representing extreme political thought. And I mean, I don't consider Ilhan Omar that far to the left, and on top of that, her views are not wacky and insulting in the way that Marjorie Taylor Greene's are. Marjorie Taylor Greene basically implied that forest fires were being caused by Jewish space lasers. I guess she called them Rothschild space lasers, according to Snopes. Now, that said, it seems like JJ McCullough has noticed what I noticed. He calls himself a conservative, yet the conservative views come up so rarely in his channel, people might start to wonder, is he still a conservative? What actually is his ideology? So he put out this video recently called My Political and Philosophical Beliefs Explained. So here's the crux of the video. JJ describes his conservatism as a lifelong identity. And what's kind of unique about him is, unlike other conservatives, he's not afraid of using the word privilege. He says, yes, I had a privileged upbringing, and I would like that privileged Canadian first world upbringing to be the experience of other people. Thus, I am a conservative. I want to conserve the Canadian way of life. He cites Edmund Burke as an influence, and Edmund Burke is a famous conservative thinker, but he was most famous for speaking out about the excesses of the French Revolution, not sort of more capital C conservative policies. So he was a conservative in the sense of protect what's good about the old system from what's bad about change, not sort of more abstract conservative values. On top of that, JJ notes that he might not seem like a conservative to certain listeners because he doesn't seem like modern extremes of conservatism. So he's a gay man. He doesn't like the Christian, theocratic, and especially evangelical tendencies of conservatives like George W. Bush. And he's also not a big fan of the bigoted, anti-intellectual opinions of people like Donald Trump. Unfortunately, what JJ does not touch on in his videos is any specific policy. He does vaguely suggest support for free markets. And here's where my critique of JJ comes in. So you're not a socialist, you're some kind of capitalist. We disagree on that, but I don't think that makes you a conservative. And I'm going to get back to that in a second. One final point JJ makes about the character of how he is now as a commentator is that he's not so much anti left as unleft. So he's not Joe McCarthy. He's not here trying to purge the communists, but he's trying to create a channel that represents an alternative to preaching, virtue signaling, everything is a dire symbol of late capitalism stuff. No, he's just here to have some fun in a way that people with all kinds of political perspectives can respect. And fair enough, going back to that James Baldwin quote, going too far, I'd like to live in a world where I can like all kinds of people. It's a better world where I like the people who I don't agree with politically than where I'm doomed to not like all the people I don't get politically. So this video isn't so much an attack on JJ, it's just an exercise in curiosity. And one question I really have for him is, despite everything you said, I still don't understand why you identify as a conservative. So let's start with his gratitude, his framing of being grateful for growing up in Canada. This kind of casual, Canada's a good country, we should be grateful. I'm very familiar with it because those are the kids I went to school with in Toronto. Those kids were cautious about preserving the status quo. They would talk about all the horrors of communism and how they thought capitalism was good to some extent. And yet, they would never identify with the capital C Conservative Party or small c conservatism, both of which JJ McCullough has done. They would understand that their broad appreciation for Canada, for capitalism, for liberal human rights was perfectly compatible with Canada's center-left political parties, the Liberals and the New Democrats. Some of them might even be involved with the Green Party. So if I were to ask these kids I went to school with about particular activist left positions, hard anti-war stuff, free education, even something symbolic like abolishing the monarchy, they'd disagree with me. But when it came to identifying with the party that was broadly skeptical of immigration, not doing enough on climate change, too far in the free markets direction, they say, no, we're not that. We like Canada, we're capitalists, but we're certainly not conservatives. And so that was the kind of default Canadian patriotism I grew up with. And given that JJ is from British Columbia, and granted, I don't know what part of British Columbia he's from, that could make a difference, but I'm kind of surprised his political cultural space wasn't similar to the Toronto one. Toronto being part of the same political environment as New York and Chicago, and British Columbia being part of the same political environment as Washington and Oregon, both bastions of liberalism in the United States politics. But this theme with JJ identifying as a conservative, even though all he has is broadly not far left positions, it's something I also noticed with that other conservative I mentioned earlier, Saagar Enjeti. So Saagar Enjeti, I'm slightly more familiar with the details of his policy worldview because he has a more interesting political story. Basically, there used to be this show on the news network The Hill called Rising, and it was a standard liberal versus conservative debate show with Crystal Ball representing the left Democrat liberal position and Buck Sexton representing the right conservative Republican position. Buck Sexton leaves the show and is replaced with Saagar Enjeti. But there's a problem. Saagar Enjeti identifies as a conservative, but he and Crystal come to realize, wait a minute, we have a surprising amount of things in common despite the way Saagar self-identifies. Notably, unlike a lot of conservatives where conservative economics come first, Saagar Enjeti had doubts about conservative economics. He agreed there was too much money in politics. He agreed the Democrats were unfairly screwing Bernie Sanders in the primary process. And so rather than having a debate show, what he and Crystal developed was a sort of common vision show where, despite having some vastly different opinions, they both realized it was not ordinary people, but rich people, the political elite class, who were screwing over average Americans and trying to develop as much of a common critique of that as possible. That said, occasionally an outright conservative position from Saagar's does come out on the show, and it forces him to debate with Crystal Ball. But while I say outright conservative, I just mean conservative compared to Crystal Ball. So Saagar's conservative positions, as far as I can tell, is that he wants a more restrictive immigration system. He believes that the police should be deployed when protests start to get out of hand, and worried about the rise of China. Now, the thing with all those positions is that they are perfectly compatible with establishment center-left parties, throughout the liberal capitalist world. I mean, we've certainly seen so-called progressive politicians give immigrants a really hard time. We've seen progressive mayors see their police forces crack down on demonstrations. And we've certainly seen people from all sides of the political spectrum criticize China. And yet, just despite having these vaguely right of center positions that are compatible with liberal political parties, Sagar Enjeti does, or at least has, identified with being a conservative. And it seems like JJ McCullough's decision is to do that in an even more extreme way. He likes capitalism. He likes the Canadian way of life. You know who loves to brag about how great Canada is? The friggin' Liberal Party. Their nationalism has been their thing as long as I've been around. So I guess what confounds me about JJ McCullough is I can tell he's no communist, but there's a huge political ground between communist and conservative. And I'm just genuinely curious why he identifies as conservative. Part of me maybe doesn't want to know, because maybe then I'd like his videos less. But I guess the nerd in me is just curious. Beyond that, JJ, in his recent video on what his ideology is, and identified more of his cultural commentary approach rather than direct policy positions for why he's a conservative. And I would just question why these have to come from a conservative space. So he doesn't get, for instance, why Canada has to be bilingual when there are not that many people in Canada who actually speak French, when it means the prime minister then basically has to come from either Ottawa or Montreal, like the two big cities you're most likely to be really bilingual, et cetera, et cetera. And JJ's perspective kind of comes from a conservative, well, the English won, screw the French, let's stop being so nice to them. I think you could make a similar argument, but from more of an accessibility perspective. So, why do so many Anglophones, including myself, have doubts about the status of French in Canada? Well, in Toronto, I've been taking French classes since I was in the fourth grade. They start mandatory French when you're 9 years old. You have to take it at least through grade 9, the ninth grade, and then I continued it all the way through high school. And then, after that for school, I went to Quebec. I listened to podcasts. I did everything I could to learn French. And yet, when it came to actually speaking to French people, unless they spoke very slowly, minimizing the liaison in their accents, not using any more sophisticated idioms or slang, I didn't understand a thing they said. I'm 28 years old. I've been learning French for 19 years, and I'm still monolingual. The left critique of the language debate in Canada is that we have to stop making it about equality of languages and start saying, okay, French is a cool part of Canadian culture. How can we do a better job of making learning French seem less threatening to Anglophones and speakers of other languages? I mean, clearly there are other countries that are better at speaking languages. Like you go to Sweden or the Netherlands or lots of places in Europe, and as JJ said in one of his own videos, learning English is treated as easy as learning to read. I've done well in all my school subjects. I even got, A's in French. And yet learning a language seems like a total mystery to me. So here's a proposal, JJ. Rather than just saying, let's give up on French because English is won, or going the sort of Quebec nationalist route of saying, let's make it harder to speak English in Quebec, let's gradually make it easier for people to speak this language that has for a long time been part of our culture. And we can also expand that conversation to learning other languages, including indigenous languages. Another point JJ makes on the cultural front is that he is down with consumer culture, and he sees this as contrasting him with the left. Now, I guess JJ's about 10 years older than me, so he was more of age in the 90s than I was, but his mind is really stuck in the 90s on this one because being anti-consumerist, that's not really a left position. That's more of when capitalism was seen as absolutely victorious in the 1990s. No one was talking about socialism, and the best people could come up with as an alternative is we're all consumers, so we're going to do our best to minimize our consumerist impact. We're going to be anti-consumerist rather than socialist. Whereas, so I would say that most people on the left, they're vaguely anti-consumerist or they don't really care. But if you are quote unquote pro-consumerist, that doesn't necessarily make you a conservative. So one of my favorite videos of JJ McCullough is when he promoted these Instagram nostalgia artists where they use various symbols from 80s and 90s pop culture. These artists who I all like just as much as JJ does include Rashid Loft, Trey Turnbull, and dyslect. A recurring image I notice in art in this style is references to Blockbuster Video. Again, this is consumerist. It's an ode to a brand, yet this seems like a particularly anti-capitalist choice. Why? Capitalism has said you're not allowed to like Blockbuster anymore because it's market inefficient to rent videos. You can just stream now. Whereas I think lots of us are on the mindset, no, the reason why we liked consuming about Blockbuster, there was something magical about the space. Movies were more magical when you had to go onto this journey to this distinct blue and yellow lit up world to search for your video rather than just mindlessly clicking. And whether it's, vintage brands or outdated gaming systems or Blockbuster, all this nostalgia art speaks to things we don't have anymore. And a big reason we don't have anymore is because all these things relied on the private market. And once they were no longer profitable, they went away. Whereas in a planned economy, it might work out that we, maybe don't have as many blockbusters as before, but we still have some blockbusters because they're a nice public space. They're a thing that means something to someone in a community. So in a weird way, some parts of consumerism are actually anti-capitalist. The only kind of consumerism that's actually consistent with capitalism is a completely dispassionate consumerism where you don't care at all what you buy. You just buy like a zombie. And these artists who say, no, we felt something about what we bought, even though they're using brands in their art, they're actually making a kind of anti-capitalist art. So overall, those are my sort of intellectual quibs with JJ. I don't understand why he identifies as a conservative rather than, a centrist or even center left. And I think his views that he views as culturally at odds with the left aren't necessarily at odds with left thinking. That said, I understand JJ's temptation to make an unleft space. It can be tiring, even if you agree with the ideas, to be constantly preached at by supposedly pop culture commentators. At the same time, I would say to people who are a bit weary of the left, sometimes it's not about escaping the left, it's about finding the part of the left that's right for you. So just as JJ distinguishes between anti-left and unleft, I distinguish between being anti-social justice warrior, which is a right-wing position, and post-social justice warrior, which is a left-wing position. A left-wing position that acknowledges lots of the analysis of so-called social justice warriors, but tries to be more nuanced, tries to focus on uniting economic claims rather than just telling everyone how they're so horrible all the time and just saying, check your privilege. Rather, they try and talk about inspiring ways about how we can come together and fight for a better world for all. So if you are looking for that kind of political content, there's lots of great options. Unfortunately, Michael Brooks passed away, but his old videos are great. Brianna Joy Gray, from an intellectual perspective, has taken off where he left off, running some of the most nuanced and thoughtful interviews out there, though she is wrong about the Beatles. There are a number of podcasts I really like, Crystal Kyle and Friends, Useful Idiots. The academic Adolph Reed is fantastic as representing a sort of alternative to pop social justice and trying to bring things back to class politics as a way of understanding all kinds of oppressions. And finally, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the YouTuber ContraPoints. These days, she's very theatrical and complex, but go back to her oldest videos. She's someone who knows how to make leftist arguments in a way that sound reasonable to all kinds of people. She's not just preaching to the choir. So go ahead, keep watching JJ McCullough's videos. I genuinely like them. I think he's a very good cultural commentator, but maybe don't listen to him on politics. As the great Michael Brooks said, left is best, my friends. Left is best.